Now for the Los Angeles County Civil Grand Jury. I think this is a very interesting discussion, and I think you'll find it interesting as well because it revolves around a governmental agency that I never knew existed, and I really never knew what they did. And they seem to actually do things that are very worthwhile. And when they ranked the cities, again, they ranked us. They ranked Santa Clarita 36. The question is, why is it 36? And what we could do to improve it, or what kind of continuous improvement we might want to do in the city. But first, let's talk about who the LA County Civil Grand Jury is. Turns out that they have the responsibility to examine all aspects of county government, all municipalities, and all special districts to make sure that they're being governed honestly, efficiently, and that monies are being spent properly. It's really interesting that there is actually a county organization that does that. The Civil Grand Jury is also in charge of and has been given the authority to investigate individual complaints. So I found it very interesting that anybody as an individual, any citizen as an individual who believes that monies have been spent improperly in relationship to some legal obligation that a municipality has within the county can go and file a complaint with the Civil Grand Jury. And of course, one would have to produce evidence that was compelling, and then they would, in fact, go and investigate it. Now, this is a separate organization from the criminal grand jury, which I'm sure that everybody is familiar with. They've all heard about it. You know, somebody is suspected of or charged with a crime, and they want to decide whether or not they're going to prosecute them. In a lot of cases, they go before a criminal grand jury, and we see that on all the Perry Mason episodes and all the other shows. But they never talk about the civil grand jury. Well, it turns out that the civil grand jury consists of 23 people and a number of alternates in case they can't make it. And they're selected from a volunteer pool. So if you actually want to do this, you could volunteer, or you could be nominated directly by a superior court judge. And then they take and randomly select from those volunteers those 23 members. And it's done each July. The jury members are sworn in, and they will serve for a full year. And their service is full-time. This is a full-time job. This is not something that is just a show up, once a month and have a little chat. So who may ask the civil grand jury to investigate? Well, I thought it's interesting. Like I said, any private citizen can. Any official, elected official, or employee may go and provide a complaint in writing. And when you go to their website, their complaint form is listed right on there. And the civil grand jury limits its investigation to possible felonies and charges of malfeasance, charges of wrongdoing if they think someone has done something wrong, or misfeasance, doing a lawful act and in an unlawful way by public officials. So if we have a public official that is spending money incorrectly, and I think this comes at very much of a discussion of things like Proposition 218 assessment districts, where you have voted a district to spend money for a specific and particular item. If for some reason that money is being spent inappropriately, there's a place to go and talk to those people about it. Any request that you provide or anyone else provides for an investigation needs to have supporting evidence, and then the grand jury will look at it, and if the evidence submitted is sufficient, then they'll perform a detailed investigation. These paragraphs basically come off of their website. This is what they say they do. And I thought it's really interesting because it is such an in-depth activity. Now, the civil grand jury is also divided into committees, so everybody on the committee doesn't do every investigation. And each one of those committees will concentrate on certain things, certain departments or functions of city or county government. And they're looking to see if it meets the special needs. And at the end of the jury's term, a final report is prepared and put on their website. So you can actually just go out to Yahoo or Google and say, Civil Grand Jury, and up will pop their website. And when their website pops up, it will, in fact, have those reports available to you. And they will also include rebuttal statements if, say, for example, the complaint is against the city or it's against a particular individual, and that individual wants to rebut the allegations, then they post that as well. So here's the contact information for the civil grand jury, and it's on West Temple, and of course there's their website. So if you want to either contact them by looking at their website or go down in person, you know where to find them. Well, what happened is that we had the city of Bell, right? And with the city of Bell, they saw all forms of misuse or perceived misuse of public funds. So what the civil grand jury did was they formed a committee, the physical health, governance, financial management, and compensation. And they had several members. How many are there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Work on that committee to investigate or rank all the cities in Los Angeles County. So this isn't just one person, and this is truly an independent look, and you'll see that it's basically in two parts. One part is data, and one part is from a questionnaire. And just to give you an idea of how in-depth the discussion is, so you don't realize it's just not something that happens, in a day or two. That report from 2000 for this year was around 300 pages long, and page 85 to 160 are the pages that deal with the city investigations. So in their executive summary, they turned around and they said, we've requested information from all 88 incorporated cities in Los Angeles County. And what they want to do is they want to say, what's the physical health of those cities? Are those cities doing well, or are they in jeopardy of going bankrupt? And in addition to just noting whether or not the cities are financially solvent, they want to see if the cities are following what they consider to be best practices for governance and financial. It's really easy to be financially solvent by not meeting the needs of the public and not spending money. So they're looking to say, are you following the best practices so that you're actually using the money properly, and are you financially solvent? And by the way, they also looked at employee compensation against some of the recent legislation and government code. And I wanted to put that one to bed right away, because from the city of Santa Clarita, it only showed, they were asking, how many employees do you have in the city that make over $200,000 a year? And some of the cities had quite a few. And I remember looking at some of the charts and seeing cities that had fire inspectors that were making over $200,000 a year. So it was very interesting. In the data from the city of Santa Clarita, we only have 2 employees in the city, and they're in the city manager's office. And of course, this is last year's data, with a salary of over $200,000 a year, so we pretty well know who those 2 people are. So here was their methodology. What they did was they decided to review each city's financial report, or ask for financial statements from each city. And then they developed financial ratios and criteria to rate all of the financial health of the cities within the different criteria that they had established. And then they ranked the cities based on those ratios and criteria. So that's one of the things we're going to look at, and then we're going to look at what it means. And then they identified, again, what they think were best practice criteria related to how the city is governed and managed. Well, the way they did that was they developed and administered a questionnaire for each city. So it said to the city, identify your current practices related to how you govern and how you do financial management. So you got to understand, this is a city answering a questionnaire. So if the city says, oh yes, I do that, okay, like as an example, the city of Santa Clarita said, do you do financial audits? And they checked it and they said, yes, I do that. But there's no discussion of what kind of audits those are, and so you have to take the city's word that they are meeting that requirement. And then they reviewed each city's response to questionnaires, and in some cases they requested supporting documentation so they could look at those responses and made a determination of how each city ranked, and again reviewed the reasonableness of salaries and compensation. And for that bullet, even though they did it, for our city, it wasn't an issue. So here's the overall ranking. Overall, for financial health, we averaged to be the 27th city in 2011, FY 2011, and the 39th city in 2012. And in their questionnaire, we answered 24 questions affirmative. That's 75% affirmative answers. And when you added all that together, we ranked 36th. Now, that's an interesting question. Again, we hear all the time, we're wonderful, we have on-time, on-schedule budgets, we have a 17, going to be a 20% reserve, we're number one, everybody's jealous of us. Well, how did we end up 36th? And if we ended up 36th, is it really important? So we'll look at it and see what it really means. So here's part of it. By the way, it would have been an eye chart if I would have shown the whole spreadsheet. Because for each one of these items, there's a spreadsheet that shows those financial statistics for every one of the 88 cities. And in this particular case, it said, what's your total revenues, expenditures, and net revenues? And it looked at it and says, in other words, how much money did you take in, and how much money did you spend? And look, we took in $133 million in 2011, and we spent $159 million. So we spent $226 million more than we took in. Now, what they're looking at is they're looking to see, obviously, are you spending more money than you make? And if you are, and you're doing this over some long period of time, you're not going to be financially solvent. Now, at the same time, the city obviously got this report. And what the city did, I'll show you the front page of this on the screen here in a little bit. The city came back and they said, well, wait a minute, for some of these things. They said, wait a minute, you have to understand what happened in that year. So these are total revenues and expenditures. And out of those total revenues, because it includes all of their expenditures, it said in those years, we built a 30,000 square foot library, the installation and rehabilitation of several miles of raised landscape medians, and a contribution toward construction of 2 additional fire stations. So what you see there is the fact that what they're saying, and again, I got this, I had this conversation with Darren Hernandez. He said, if we look at these things and we look at it for a period of more than 2 years, well, the numbers aren't going to look that bad, because in some cases, what we have is we have monies that have been accumulated like money is accumulated in the redevelopment agency, and they're sitting there, so they're not revenue that year. And so what we do is we spend it now, and so if you look at expenditures versus revenues, it's negative, but that money was allocated to do that in the first place. So when we look at it only in this 2-year snapshot, you look down the spreadsheet and you'll see that having expenditures of 19.7% more than we take in puts us 67th down this list of cities. And so is this really an issue of financial insolvency, or is this an issue of spending money that we had pre-allocated? And you have to take this into consideration with some other numbers that come later to get a better picture of what it means. Another question is a ratio of assets to liabilities. In other words, how much do you own and how much do you owe? You know, we all know that kind of an issue. And here in the city of Santa Clarita, if we look at 2011, we had a $1.06 billion worth of assets with $171 million of liabilities. And of course, if you subtract one from the other, that makes your net assets $894 million, or a ratio of 6.22%. So you have a lot more money than you owe. And if you look in the text of what the report was saying, if your ratio of assets to liabilities is greater than 2.0, they considered you to be financially solvent. And certainly our ratios of 6.22 and then 10.14 show that we, by that definition, are financially solvent. Yet if we look at it in relationship to some other cities have better ratios. There were cities in the chart that had ratios of assets to liability of 48. So it just indicates that we're financially solvent. So is that number important? Sometimes you got to ask the question, is being number one really the important issue? Or is it being financially solvent that's the important issue? And here, too, you can notice that our assets went up in the second year, and that would account for the fact that we built those assets in the year previous, and now they come online as assets as opposed to liabilities. The next is the change in net assets. And what they're looking for here is they're saying, you know what, if you look at a city's assets, and as year to year they increase, that means that they are, in fact, have a positive cash flow. But if you see their net assets decreasing, then what that means is they're selling off their assets to pay their debt. And eventually, you know what happens if you keep taking money out of the bank, right? Eventually, you end up with nothing. So in this case, again, the text that goes behind these numbers say if the numbers are increasing, you're headed in the right direction. And depending upon the percentage of change of how quickly they're going in that direction depends upon where you're ranked with other cities. So here again, I think these numbers say we are financially solvent. And even though we rank 43 because our change isn't as big as some other cities, I'm not sure that's an important issue to be number one. Next comes general fund revenues, and I think this is one of the ones that are the most interesting. And it talks about revenues and expenditures within the general fund, because we've had some interesting expenditures out of the general fund. And again, if we go back and we look at their letter and talk about what went on, they had and bought into a post-employment benefits fund for city employees to pay for city employees' health care benefits. They put in $20 million, which was being held in the general fund. They put it into a separate fund to account for that over the long term. The question, of course, is going to be, is that going to be a sufficient amount, or is more money going to get pulled out? And we don't know that yet, especially since we don't know what the new health care laws are going to do to healthcare costs. And really, when we see a change in the general fund balance, that's where you can really see the almost $20 million. Because what happens is you can see that the general fund balance has gone down from 2011 to 2012. And the rationale and the reason why it did was that $20 million that was removed from the general fund for health care benefits for retirees. But I think the most interesting number is the general fund balance indicators. Let's go back here for just a minute, because I've always wondered is that 7.6% balance over what increase in balance, is that the reserve? Is that this miraculous 15% reserve we've been hearing about? And we look here and we can see that between FY 2011 and 2012, the general fund balance increased from 46 million to 50 million. And that's something that I was always curious about, because we always hear about this 14%, 16%, 13% reserve. So here in the report, we'll get this gets a little bit more interesting. Is a discussion that in the year ending 2007, the fund balance for our general fund was $62 million. And we project that the fund balance as of 2013 will be approximately $70 million. Now, 2007, 2008, 2009, 10, 11, 12, 13, 6 years, an increase of $7 million, approximately $1.2 million a year. That's interesting, because what they're saying is the fiscal year 13-14 has an operating reserve of $13.1 million. So that's the question, what does that mean? That means we start with $13.1 million as a reserve at the beginning of the year, but we're certainly not saving anywhere near that amount of money over the long pull. So I think it's going to be interesting, because when we talk about this a little bit later, we're going to talk about the fact that one of the recommendations to the city is to determine performance indicators. You know, like I said, it's real easy to be financially solvent. I can be financially solvent if I have a large family and I don't spend more than I make. They may starve, but I won't spend more than I make. And in this case, I can turn around and say, I'm not going to spend $13 million this year, but did I really spend it at the end of the year? And that's a question that really needs to be answered. So they sent out a questionnaire, and I think this is what the crust of the situation is, because now we see the data. We know that we are financially solvent. We've got enough money, and we are doing well. But what about some of the things that the city answered no to? Okay? One of the things that they answered no to was they do not have performance indicators. Now, Carl's in the back of the room. He knows that for large projects, they have something called performance measurement. It's a question of measuring not only how much you're spending, but how much you get done at the same time, so that you at any time throughout the project can determine whether you are ahead of schedule, behind schedule, over budget, or under budget. And the idea, of course, is always to stay on schedule and on budget. But you can look at that constantly. And by looking at it constantly gives you the ability to react constantly and make changes. One would think that if the Burmite cleanup was being managed with performance measurement, it wouldn't have taken 15 years to know that they haven't got done. It would have been known right away. Now, in this document from the city, they say they don't want to do performance indicators. But in my last conversation with Darren, he said now they're considering doing performance indicators. So let's see what in fact happens. The next is a formal audit committee. So we know that in many cases it's really a good thing to have people take an independent look at issues. And these were actually several different questions that I grouped together because I think the issue groups together. One of the things that companies for the last 30 years have been doing and have been asking, different governmental agencies have been asking companies that deal in government contracts to do, and I know that the police department does it, LAPD does it, Spence was a part of it, is to do internal process audits. So that you go back and you say, I know this is what I want done. Is it really happening? And if it isn't really happening, to make it known so that you can go and you can improve your process. One of the other questions happened to be a regular suggestion of replacing your external auditors, to not use your external auditors over a long period of time. Why? Because they become too chummy with you, right? And all of a sudden you don't get the, you're getting the answer you want to hear isn't necessarily what's in the best interest of your organization or your company. And whether or not they can do non-audit services, and those non-audit services can be varying different things of looking at your how you're operating all the time. So I think the most interesting one was the fact that they were dealing with fraud and saying, do you have a method by which your employees or the public can anonymously report fraud? Okay. Now, I got to tell you what. I've watched the chloride issue go. I've watched certain things go in other governmental agencies, other things in the city. Do you think that you're working and you're having a fine job and you know something is wrong, that you're going to jump up in the middle of the city manager's meeting and say, that's wrong. This guy is doing it the wrong way. We're going to get caught. No. But if you have a way to anonymously report it, and then you have somebody that's actually going to look at it, all right, that's the way you catch those kind of things. So these are the best practices that the county is saying, you know what, city, you ought to go put in place, and we'll see what it was. I thought it was really funny because in the audit committee, I can read you their report in the audit committee. It says that although it's a best practice, we believe having our current practice of having our mayor and mayor pro tem interact with staff of the independent auditor during the annual audit process, and with the independent auditor ultimately responsible to the full city council. Well, I don't know about you, but I think if the independent auditor wants to come back next year, okay, you're probably going to get pretty much what you want to hear. All right, so the other thing is updating policies, and that's one near and dear to my heart. I had an organization that I managed, and one of the requirements that were laid on me by my corporate office was that we had to review our procedures and practices every 2 years. So some of the departments would go and every 2 years they'd come out with some process and procedure to go through that. I chose a different way. I decided that what I did was I divided up all of our processes and procedures into 2 years' worth, and at every staff meeting we talked about one of them. And when we talked about it, here was the way it went. The rules of the game was it was perfectly acceptable to say you weren't doing it. All you have to do is explain why. And if, in fact, you can convince us that's the wrong process, we'll change it. But if you can't, then you have to go back and fix what you've been doing. So we went through every process, we went through each one of these at each staff meeting, and I was amazed to see how processes changed over the 2 years just under the weight of what I considered to be a real lightweight bureaucracy, but it turned out to be much different than I would have imagined. And you have to correct it and bring people back into doing what it is that we actually wanted to have accomplished. And then the last one of the best practices they talked about was having a controls override process. So if you have controls on things, and something isn't going right, how do you fix it? Right? You're going to have to somehow, you can't just say, well, we're going to keep on going that way because that's the way the rules are. You know, you're going to have to think about it. You're going to have to put something in place as a normal way of doing business. And I guess I also understand coming to any organization, especially if you think you're really doing well, and coming up with a new best practice or new idea that you haven't thought about. I remember the first time someone came to me and talked about risk management, and I couldn't figure out what that was. It took a long time to understand what it was, to get educated on what it was, and then it turns out to be one of the most important methodologies you can use to stay on track. So I can understand where somebody outside says to the city, you know, you really need to do these things, and they're a little reluctant. But they did publish a report and a rebuttal indicating some things that they would do and some things that they would not. So this is the front page of that, and this is all the way back. I think this is interesting too because it's all the way back on July 18th. You know, now of course you've seen lots of articles in the Signal about this, right? No. Lots of articles from KHITS? No. It's interesting that we haven't talked about this a great deal. So here's my conclusion. Whenever you have any kind of an organization, and the bigger the organization, the more likelihood that this is a great idea. That having an objective outside review of your organization's practices and health, financial health, is always beneficial. It's always better to have someone that's detached from the organization and someone that isn't trying to get a job to come back next year, because you really want to be told the truth. And what that does for you is it provides opportunities for continuous improvement. That's what every company, every city, every organization has to strive, because if you're not getting better month to month, year to year, everybody else is passing you by. It's a very important thing. And I think the ranking among cities is not as telling as the actual practices that are in place. So again, this isn't a softball game. We're not trying to find out who scored the most runs. What we're trying to do is look at our practices and our policies and see if, in fact, they're being handled in a way that shows that we're financially solvent and we're doing things the right way. And if someone else is maybe a little better, maybe they're an older city and they have far more assets and their liabilities are lower because just simply they don't have as much stuff to build, well, maybe their ratios can go up higher. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it is better. It's just they're in a different situation and a different phase of life. So I think doing the right thing is what is most important, and measuring it so that you know you're doing the right thing is very important. And so when we look at finances, it actually looks like they are doing well. We're not insolvent, okay, but we're not perfect either. And we certainly can find some way to improve. So my recommendation to the city would be avoid the pitfall of just defending yourself. There's always the danger that someone comes up to you and says, you know, you could do that a lot better, and you don't want to hear it. You know, it's insulting. You know, it's just not what you're used to hearing. But being too close to issues sometimes put those issues out of focus. I tried not to say, you know, you couldn't see the forest for the trees. That's what most of the time it is. But if you're too close, sometimes you just lose track of what's going on. And you should always avoid negative justifications. And I've heard those at City Hall too many times. You know, this has never been a problem. Never been a problem. I don't know why. I don't know why I need an emergency brake on my car. It's never been a problem. The brakes have never failed. You know, we've always done it that way. Worked for us last year and the year before and the year before that. So what's the matter? So you got to avoid those and start thinking about what it is that you can do to make things better. And I believe that you take this report and you use it to identify and improve and implement improvement opportunities. And when you do that, I like to say you need to incorporate value-added practices that we lack. So when you look at what you're going to do to improve, you don't just sit there and say, they told me to do this, so I'm going to do it. You want to look at it, understand what the practice is, understand what the behavior is, and implement it in a way that benefits you. Because if there's no benefit to you, you shouldn't do it. And you should look and say, how many of my processes are marginal? I'll give you one the city has that's marginal right now. Independent auditors. Because right now what happens is they come in and they do an independent audit of bookkeeping and bookkeeping practices. They don't audit what the money is spent for. That's a marginal process as far as I'm concerned. Think about, should we improve that? Should we end up having our expenditures audited for appropriateness, etc.? So you could always identify and improve on marginal processes and then make practices that we do well. If we do them well, maybe we can do them even better. And we can always look for those kinds of things. I was at a presentation last night talking about health care. And they were talking about the transition from paper records to electronic records. Well, you know, paper records were good. We always did it that way. You know, we could always find them. Well, maybe electronic records are even better, so that no matter where you're at, you can bring them up rather than having to call and have someone fly them out to you. So there's always a way to do things better. And I think that if we take these recommendations and look at them as opportunities for improvement, we'll end up in a much better position as a city, and we'll perform much better services for all of our residents. So, are there any questions?
On the civil grand jury, do they have any? What happens to these reports? Does it go to the supervisors? What if they were to not hear? But what would they have if they had discovered the Bell scandal? What is there any teeth to this, or they just make the report and put it online?
No, when I read it, you know, I only gave you a little bit of what was on the website, but I got the impression from reading it that let's say that they let's say you put in a complaint, the complaint was considered legitimate, and somebody or something did something that was illegal. Then they would recommend it to the criminal grand jury for prosecution. So no, they just don't write the report and go away. If in fact it is something that is criminal, they will recommend that action be taken, and it would go to the appropriate place.